Hey historians, are you ready for your virtual video for today? This is our Tuesday video, and I am at Yorktown, Virginia. Behind me is the Yorktown Monument. If we pan the camera a little bit that way, I think you can see the water out there, where that water was important because General Cornwallis, who was waiting here, was hoping for reinforcement and resupply coming in ships up that water to enable him to continue battling here at Yorktown with the American Continental Army. So in the summer of 1780, 5,500 French troops with the Count de Rochambeau, French guy, at the helm, landed at Newport, Rhode Island to aid the Americans, to aid the Continental Army. At the time, the British forces were fighting in two different places. General Henry Clinton was fighting in New York City and the area around New York, while General Cornwallis, who had already captured the cities of Charleston and Savannah down in the Carolinas, was headed up from the south to this region. The Americans needed a big victory because they were hoping to be able to convince a peace conference that would be held somewhere in Europe when the war ended that they had the right to demand independence for all 13 colonies. So with the Continental Army positioned in New York, Washington and Rochambeau teamed up to plan a timed attack on the British Army with the arrival of new French forces, reinforcements. And then when Cornwallis, as we talked about earlier, when we talked about the Battle of the Virginia Capes, Cornwallis was coming north and the British fleet was coming from the West Indies, and they were both completely surprised by the presence of the French fleet, which led to the Battle of the Virginia Capes, which ended indecisively but did not allow British forces to reinforce New York. So with the expectation that the Continental Army would attack at New York, they instead snuck away from New York to come here south to attack Cornwallis. Washington actually ordered the construction of fake army camps, and they built these fake brick bread ovens that were really large that you could see, that created the illusion that the Continental Army was preparing to settle down there and stay for a while Washington also prepared false papers that discussed attack plans on Clinton in New York and made sure that those fell into the hands of a British spy, who then took them back to Clinton. And they're thinking, okay, Cornwallis is fine because all the American army is mostly here. And that fooled Clinton, and Washington and the rest of the army with Rochambeau was able to march south without the British knowledge. So by September of 1781, Washington and Rochambeau arrived in Williamsburg, which is 13 miles that way from here. This is Yorktown. It was a port at that time, a port largely for the exportation of tobacco, because this was a major tobacco growing region, which was the wealthiest crop in the New World. So Cornwallis, when they got here, they discovered that he had built 10 small forts, and those small forts are called redoubts. And, sorry, fix my papers. They had artillery batteries, meaning their guns were set up on platforms. They had trenches dug that connected the redoubts with each other. And Cornwallis had asked General Clinton for aid, and he had been promised 500 soldiers setting sail from New York. I'm sorry, 5,000 soldiers setting sail from New York to Yorktown. So there's just a small force left in New York, 2,500 Americans and 4,000 French soldiers, and there are 8,000 British troops. And they begin digging their own trenches about 800 yards from the British and start an artillery assault on the enemy on October 9th. And the heavy cannons just pounded the British mercilessly and knocked out most of the British guns. So that meant down here in Virginia that Cornwallis got really bad news for him, that the British departure from New York to reinforce him was delayed because most of their artillery was damaged or destroyed. So they would have to wait for resupply before they could come down to assist Cornwallis. So Washington ordered another trench to be built closer to the British lines, to be dug, I should say. But that meant first they had to take out 2 British redoubts, number 9 and number 10, those little small forts I mentioned before. The attack on redoubt number 9 would be undertaken by the French troops under the Marquis de Lafayette, while number 10 would be led by an army led by Colonel Alexander Hamilton. We've heard of him before. He was, of course, one of the founding fathers, and he actually at this point wasn't really the top pick of the Major General Marquis de Lafayette, but Hamilton really wanted to improve his reputation by proving that he could be a success on the battlefield, because for most of Hamilton's career during the war, he had been George Washington's right-hand man, and George Washington didn't want to risk Hamilton on the battlefield. And so after months and months of convincing, Washington finally agreed, all right, you can do it. You can lead the charge on redoubt number 9. So they began with a siege of these redoubts, just preventing them from being resupplied with any food, any supplies, any new artillery, and they wanted to end the siege quickly and with a surprise. So Washington ordered that they would attack each redoubt using bayonets. Now, if you don't already know, a bayonet is like a long knife that a soldier could attach to the end of his gun. And so instead of firing their guns at the British troops, they were going to go right into these little small forts, they weren't large, with their bayonets and attack that way. And so after nightfall on October 14th, the Allies began to fire shells into the air, one after the other, that illuminated the sky. They would explode in the sky, and then you could see what was going on. And at that point, Hamilton and his men, they came up out of their trenches and they sprinted across about a quarter of a mile of field with their fixed bayonets on the end of their guns. But for the sake of silence and surprise, and also because they wanted to be able to brag that the entire victory was a bayonet battle victory, they actually unloaded all their ammunition and went in with bayonets alone. And so this is going to be hand-to-hand combat only. There won't be any weapons fired. So they dodged heavy artillery fire, and then they had also decided they were going to attack with a lot of surprise the way the Native Americans often attacked outposts in the frontier. They would let out huge war whoops and yelling and screaming as they arrived at the redoubt to startle their enemies. And the whole battle took less than 10 minutes before the Continental Army, that little piece, Alexander Hamilton's little piece of it, had defeated redoubt number 9. And Hamilton only lost 9 men in the attack. There were 30 wounded, but as a result of it, Hamilton became something of a war hero, because they had done this solely bayonet attack and had been so successful and happened so quickly with limited wounded. Now they are surrounded by enemy fire, the British are. Cornwallis is. He's trapped. He has found out that there is no hope of receiving aid from either New York or from the British fleet in the south, because as you might remember when we talked about the Battle of the Virginia Capes, the British fleet was damaged by the French, and they had to head to New York for repairs. So there was no one to come help Cornwallis. And he's caught up in a siege. And we should probably talk for 1 second about what is a siege. A siege is when 2 armies get entrenched and one army manages to prevent any way for the other army to escape, to move, to be resupplied, usually by digging trenches and manning all these trenches around one army. So now Cornwallis is trapped. He can't get help from the sea. They have surrounded him on the land. They're running out of food. They're running out of artillery. It's really looking pretty hopeless for Cornwallis at this point. And so basically the resistance from the British has been snuffed out. In a final effort on October 16th, General Cornwallis tried to escape in small boats out to sea, hoping to be able to row farther up the coast where they could escape. But unfortunately there was a big storm that night which prevented them from leaving in boats. And so by the morning of October 17th, the British sent forward a drummer boy in a red coat, followed by a fully uniformed officer with a white handkerchief, waving a white handkerchief, and all the guns fell silent because Cornwallis had surrendered. The last battle of the American Revolution ended. Cornwallis surrendering his sword and his army to General George Washington and the Continental and French armies was the end of the Revolutionary War. October 19th, 1781, here in Yorktown. Following the Battle of Yorktown and Cornwallis's surrender, the British now down a third in terms of the number of men they have. The British Parliament in March of 1782 passed a resolution saying the war was over, calling the nation to end the war, and the Prime Minister, whose name was Frederick North, exclaimed, "Oh God, it's all over," upon hearing that Cornwallis had to surrender. The British, however, still had 30,000 men in North America at this time, occupying the seaports at New York and Charleston and Savannah. But the loss at Yorktown really diminished the British will to continue to fight in America anymore. And so September 3rd, 1783, the Revolutionary War came to an official end in, of all places, Paris. Often peace talks in European wars and even in modern wars take place in the city of Paris. So they signed the Treaty of Paris. The treaty recognized that America was now independent. All 13 colonies were independent as a nation. Of course, it took some negotiating. They worked out some terms, but they were very favorable for the British. Basically, most of the British territory in the New World was granted to the Americans, including all the land to the Mississippi River, as well as what they called the Northwest Territory. At that point, we would call it the Northern Midwest nowadays, but it's as far as the English had gone, and it included the area that is now the states of Ohio and Michigan, Indiana, Illinois, Wisconsin, and Minnesota. So that was a big chunk of territory, and it actually doubled the size of the United States of America, which is now officially recognized by the world as its own independent country. See y'all Thursday. Thanks for watching, and bye for now.